cold air moved off the Thames as the parson crossed Tower Wharf a little before 7 in the morning, his black cassock catching against the wind, his square white collar pale against the grey light. The guards at the gate barely looked up. They knew him by now, or at least thought they did. A mild clergyman who had become a familiar face at the Tower over the past several weeks, always polite, always expected. What none of them noticed, because there was nothing to notice, was that a man who had no business owning a key to anyone's trust had spent that time acquiring one anyway, visit by visit, until walking through the gate required no explanation at all. The man calling himself Thomas Ailiff was in fact Thomas Blood, and by the spring of 1671 he had already failed at almost everything he had attempted. Years earlier he had planned to seize Dublin Castle and had watched that plot collapse before it even began. Twice he had gone after James Butler, Duke of Ormond, once in an attempted kidnapping that ended with Blood fleeing into the Dutch countryside, and once again in London, where Ormond escaped him a second time, wounded but alive. Blood's own estates in Ireland had been confiscated after the Restoration, and by the time he adopted his clerical disguise and his borrowed name, he was a man with very little left to lose and a long, humiliating record of failing to take anything back by force. Beyond the Tower's walls, London was already awake. Watermen shouted across the Thames, calling for fares from bank to bank. Coal barges drifted upriver with the tide, and church bells marked the hour above a city still built largely from timber, its skyline broken by spires rather than any of the taller structures a modern visitor might expect. Barely 5 years had passed since the Great Fire had torn through much of the city, and rebuilding was still visibly underway in places. Scaffolding and raw new brick standing beside older streets the flames had never reached. This was the London Blood moved through unnoticed, a city so busy rebuilding and reordering itself that one more clergyman calling on friends near the Tower drew no particular attention from anyone. In April, dressed as the parson and accompanied by a woman posing as his wife, Blood had first presented himself at the Martin Tower, a squat stone tower in the northeast corner of the fortress, and asked to see the crown jewels. The keeper who answered the door was Talbot Edwards, a former soldier in his late 70s who had been given charge of the regalia and was permitted to earn a little extra by showing them to paying visitors. This was not a role Edwards treated lightly. Every showing followed the same careful sequence, greeting the visitors at the door, leading them down the narrow stone stairs, unlocking the iron cupboard with a key he kept close, and lifting out objects worth more than he could ever hope to own in his lifetime, holding each piece with the particular mixture of pride and caution of a man who understood exactly what had been placed in his trust. He had performed this small ritual for years, and it had given his final working years a purpose he clearly valued, the quiet distinction of being the man who let ordinary Londoners look, briefly, at what belonged to the crown. Edwards led the couple down into that low basement room where the jewels were kept behind an iron grille, unlocking the cupboard to bring the pieces out into the candlelight. The room smelled of stone and tallow and old wood, and the coins Blood handed over rang faintly against the counter as Edwards counted them, an ordinary transaction between a stranger and an old man doing his job. Partway through that first visit, Blood's companion complained suddenly of a violent stomach pain. Edwards, alarmed, called for his wife, and the two women helped the visitor upstairs into the family's own private rooms to recover. It was a small kindness, freely given, and it worked exactly as Blood had intended. By the time the couple thanked the Edwardses and left that afternoon, a stranger who should have remained a stranger had been welcomed, however briefly, into a family's home. He returned within days, bringing 4 pairs of white gloves as a gift for Mrs. Edwards, a small gesture of gratitude for her care. The visits continued through the following weeks, each one ordinary in itself, tea taken together, the weather discussed, news exchanged, and each one adding another thread to a friendship that Edwards had no reason to doubt. Blood used the time well. He studied the layout of the Martin Tower, the position of its door, the distance to the outer gate, the rhythm of the guards' movements, all while appearing to do nothing more than enjoy the company of people he had chosen for exactly this purpose. The fortress made that kind of patient deception easier than it should have been. Beside the tower walls stood the old royal menagerie, its lions and other exotic animals drawing a steady stream of ordinary Londoners who came to simply look, to pay a fee, to stand and stare at something they would never otherwise see. Amid that daily traffic of strangers coming and going, a clergyman calling on friends inside the walls attracted no attention whatsoever. The Tower of London, however heavily fortified, was also a place where people lived, worked, sold tickets, raised children, and grew accustomed to visitors. And Blood understood that an institution built to intimidate could still be entered, again and again, simply by being polite. It was during one of these later visits that Blood made his most consequential suggestion. He had, he told Edwards, a nephew, a young gentleman of good private means, and he wondered whether the young man might be introduced to Edwards' unmarried daughter, with marriage in mind. Edwards was delighted. Here was proof, if he needed it, that his new friend valued the connection between their families as much as he did, and he began looking forward to the match with the pleasure of a father hoping to see his daughter settled well. He had, without knowing it, agreed to let the man who intended to rob him walk freely through his front door on the very morning he planned to do it. That morning arrived on the 9th of May. Blood came early, as arranged, bringing his supposed nephew and 2 other men he introduced as friends, who wished to view the jewels one last time before returning north. While the young man made conversation with Edwards' daughter upstairs, the rest of the party asked to be shown down to the jewel room, a request Edwards had granted them so many times before that it barely registered as a request at all. He led them down the familiar stone stairs, unlocking the door, and turned to reach for the grille, performing, for what he had no reason to suspect was the final time, the same careful ritual he had carried out for years. He never got the chance to open it. Blood and his companions seized the old man from behind, forced a gag into his mouth, and struck him across the head with a mallet. Edwards fought back with whatever strength a man his age could summon, refusing to go quiet, and one of the group drove a blade into his stomach to silence him. He crumpled to the floor of the room he had guarded faithfully for years, and the men who had spent weeks becoming his friends stepped over him to reach the cage behind him. They worked quickly now, the patience of the previous weeks giving way to raw urgency. The grille came away from the stone. The crown, heavy with gold and set with hundreds of stones, was flattened under repeated blows from the mallet until it could be hidden beneath Blood's cloak. The metal groaning under the strain in a way that must have sounded, in that enclosed stone room, almost like something alive. The long sceptre would not fit inside a bag hole, so one of the men sawed it in half, the sound of metal teeth working through the gold filling the small space where, moments earlier, an old man had been counting coins for a stranger he trusted. They believed Edwards was dead, or close to it, and for a few minutes it seemed the plan, against every reasonable expectation, might actually succeed. Then Edward's son came home. He walked into the Martin Tower and found his father bleeding on the floor of the jewel room. His shout carried up through the stone stairwell and out into the fortress beyond, and within moments the unhurried, familiar rhythm of the tower's daily life broke into shouting and running feet. Blood and his men scattered towards the outer gate, the crushed crown still under his cloak, the halved sceptre still in the bag at his side, moving now with none of the calm that had carried him through the previous weeks. He very nearly made it. Blood reached the outer defences before he was finally seized, still clutching the flattened crown, still insisting, even as he was dragged back inside the walls he had just tried to escape, that whatever happened next, he would answer to no one but the king. It was an extraordinary thing to say for a man caught in the act of maiming an old servant of the crown and stealing its most sacred objects, and it became more extraordinary still when the king agreed. Charles II, intrigued by the reports of the audacious Irishman now sitting in the tower's own cells, granted him a private audience, reportedly attended by Prince Rupert and the Duke of York, no reliable account of what was said in that room survives. According to one often repeated tradition, the king asked Blood what he thought his life was worth, and Blood answered that he would endeavour to deserve whatever was given him, though this exchange comes down through later retelling rather than a verified transcript, and it's difficult to know how much of it is memory and how much is legend already taking shape. What followed the meeting is not in doubt. Blood was pardoned in full. His confiscated Irish estates were restored, and he was granted a pension of £500 a year, a sum that placed him almost overnight among the comfortable rather than the desperate. The Duke of Ormond, who had twice nearly died at Blood's hands and watched him rewarded rather than hanged, was reportedly furious, and he was not alone in his disbelief. Historians continue to debate why Charles showed such mercy to a man who had shown Talbot Edwards none. Some believe Blood may have offered the crown useful intelligence about networks of dissent he had spent years moving through. Others think the king was simply captivated by his nerve, the same quality that had let him talk his way into an old man's trust, and then out of a death sentence. It is possible the truth was some mixture the record was never going to preserve, since kings rarely explain their mercy, and the men who receive it rarely question it too closely. Talbot Edwards survived his wounds, though he never received the award he had been promised in full, and he spent his remaining years back at his post in the Martin Tower, telling visitors the story of the day he was stabbed defending the crown, the same small ritual he had performed for years, now carrying a scar it hadn't carried before. Blood, meanwhile, became something close to a minor celebrity at court. A man once hunted as a traitor, now welcome in the same rooms as the people he had tried to rob and kill. He died in 1680, still drawing his pension, having never faced the punishment that every earlier plot in his life should reasonably have earned him. The crown jewels have not left the tower's protection since that morning in May, and the room where Edwards was attacked was replaced long ago by the far more secure jewel house visitors queue past today. Its glass cases and slow-moving crowds a distant, largely forgotten legacy of one old man's misplaced trust. What remains harder to resolve is not the theft itself, which failed, but the pardon that followed it, a gap in the record that historians can theorise about, but never quite close. Somewhere inside that silence sits the real shape of the story, a fortress built to guard the crown's authority, defeated for one strange afternoon, not by force, but by patience and charm, and then for reasons nobody wrote down, forgiven entirely by the very crown it had tried to rob.